Welcome to Hope One Live, ladies and gentlemen. Where do you get your hope from? Unfortunately, people in recent years who claim to be Christians appear to be getting their hope not from the true God, not from the true gospel, but another gospel, another God. And there's somebody that you may have heard of, maybe not. She's relatively new on the scene of apologetics, but she is really hitting the ground running with her expertise in what is known as liberal Christianity or progressive Christianity. And her name is Alisa Childers. And she's written a wonderful new book that unfortunately doesn't come out until October. She sent me an advance copy. The book is called Another Gospel. And we're going to talk about what's in that book because it will enlighten you as to what's been going on in Christianity, particularly when people say their faith has been deconstructed. They're no longer evangelical Christians. What does all that mean? What does liberal Christianity mean? What does progressive Christianity mean? Is there a difference? Why is this new kind of gospel attractive to people? So let's bring Alisa on. Alisa, good morning. How are you?
Hey, Frank, always great to be with you.
Great to be with you. Now, you were originally going around singing with a musical group called Zoe Girl back in the 90s and the early 2000s. And something happened to you that changed your life. What was it?
Yeah, it was radically life-changing experience for me. Often we hear stories of kids growing up in the church and growing up in Christian families and then going off to college and having their faith challenged by an evolutionary biology professor or something along those lines. Well, my story is very similar, except that my faith wasn't challenged inside the walls of a classroom, but in the pews of a church. And it wasn't
Hmm.
until I was an adult that this happened. So I was a very committed Christian for most of my life. As far back as I can even remember, I loved to read and study the Bible. And I never really had any significant intellectual doubts about my faith until I was an adult, even after the whole Zoe Girl experience. And so after Zoe Girl had come off the road, I was doing some solo music. And so I was invited to sing at a local church here in Tennessee. And we just really connected with the church, my husband and I, and connected with the pastor. And so after we began attending there for about 8 months, I was invited to be a part of a sort of inner circle type study and discussion group. And it was within the context of this class that the pastor revealed that he was actually an agnostic. He called himself a hopeful agnostic. And
Hmm.
so throughout the course of this class, virtually everything that I had believed about Jesus and about God and about especially about the Bible was just picked apart intellectually and challenged, and claim after claim after claim against these beliefs came up in class, and I had no idea how to answer those claims. And so it really propelled me into a time of significant doubt, really for the first time in my life.
Now, the pastor was an agnostic, and he was trying to lead an entire group of people because you were in a class with him
Yes.
down this road to agnosticism or liberal or progressive Christianity. Maybe we should just start there. I have an allergy to the term progressive when it comes to Christianity because I don't think there's anything progressive about it. It's regressive to get away from the Bible and what Jesus actually came and said and did. But there's a reason they call it progressive Christianity rather than liberal Christianity. What is that?
Yeah, so I began to notice after we left the church, you're right. All of the claims are very regressive. It's going back to agnosticism, even heading toward atheism. But I began to notice on Facebook and on other social media platforms after we left this phrase progressive Christianity. And then I noticed that several years after my husband and I had left this particular church, they went on to identify themselves as a progressive Christian community. So I wanted to know, what is progressive Christianity? And I mean, I had a pretty good idea because I experienced it firsthand. I actually watched a church and was part of a church that went from evangelical to progressive. I was on the inner circle of that, and so I had a kind of a grasp of what it was. But several years ago, I decided to just dive in and really study all of the progressive materials, read their books, and listen to their podcasts, and read their blog posts, and follow their platforms, and just to try to figure out what it is that unites them. And so what I discovered is that progressive Christianity is a phrase that they use to describe themselves. And so essentially, if we were just to break it down to its bare bones, I like to use the phrase historic Christianity as its opposite, because if
Mm.
you go back to the most primitive form of Christianity, the earliest creed that Paul records for us in 1 Corinthians 15, there are certain tenets there. There are certain beliefs that the earliest Christians believed, and you can trace those through things like the atonement, the resurrection of Jesus, the authority and inspiration of the scriptures. That's all in that creed there. But with progressive Christianity, essentially they're progressing beyond those things. And so the basic idea of it is that they believe that Christianity itself is progressing. So we might use the word progress in a positive way, but as G.K. Chesterton pointed out, you can be progressing toward a madhouse. You can be progressing toward all kinds of horrible things. And so progress in and of itself isn't necessarily good, except that in progressive Christianity, they essentially believe that it is. So they're seeing not just that we're progressing in our faith and in our knowledge of who God is, in our knowledge and maturity in our understanding of the scriptures, but they're seeing Christianity itself progressing. The truths that our faith is built on, those are actually progressing. So essential core historic doctrines are up for reexamination. Progressive Christians are asking questions like, does the virgin birth really matter? Does it really matter if we believe that Jesus was physically resurrected? Or is there just a great moral lesson we can learn from some of these stories? And so essentially they view themselves as progressing, but I agree with you, Frank. I think it's largely regressive. And if we go back through history, we can see where those ideas are regressing too.
You know, I call me a skeptic on this, Alisa, but I really have a skepticism about people claiming they have a problem with the virgin birth or they have a problem with the resurrection. I could be wrong, but it seems to me that their real problem with what we would call historic Christianity is not with those doctrines. It's really with let's just cut to the chase, Alisa. It has to do with sex.
Yeah.
Can we just say that? Can you explain how that might be the real motivation for saying that the historic doctrines of the Christian faith are not sure? They don't like Christian sexual morality. Is that fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say. In fact, I would say if there's one core tenet of the progressive Christian movement, and it's a movement, it's that you would have to be gay affirming in your theology. So you would either have to say the Bible got it wrong and we've progressed beyond that, or you would have to find a way to try to make the Bible scripture passages regarding biblical sexuality work for a gay affirming view. And I think it's fair to say that that would be a core tenet of the progressive Christian movement, is that not only do they believe that homosexuality is okay, but they believe it's blessed by God, it's created by God, it's something that God calls good and holy when it's in the context of monogamous, loving same-sex relationships. And I would venture to say that if you did not affirm that, you would not be accepted in that movement.
Wait, I thought that they were supposed to be inclusive, tolerant, and diverse. So
Right.
if you had a different view, they wouldn't tolerate it. Are you saying that?
I believe that's true. In fact, a perfect example of this was several years ago. Many of the viewers will be aware of when Jen Hatmaker, who has close to 1 million followers on Facebook, a very, very popular women's blogger, author, and speaker. Her books were in Lifeway, just very popular. But a few years ago, she came out in favor of same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage, which propelled her to just the spotlight in the progressive movement. And she's one of, I would say, the poster children now for that movement. But interestingly, just this past January, she had a podcast series where she invited some iconic, more evangelical type figures to come on her podcast and interact with her. And when she did that, she got got a ton of pushback on her Facebook page from her followers. Basically, people saying that this is a betrayal, that you would have evangelical, iconic pastors and speakers who do not affirm same-sex relationships publicly. And so she had to do quite a bit of damage control to try to, ease their fears. And she basically told them, look, when I was still changing my mind, when I was making up my mind, there were progressive leaders who reached out to me and gave me space for that. And essentially she told them, I'm hoping to build a bridge to help change the church's mind on this issue. And that's where this movement is very evangelistic. They're not just content to say, this is what I believe, or this is the conclusion I've come to, but there is an activism to it where they are determined to change the church's mind, not just on sexuality, but on the church's view of the Bible, the church's view of the atonement, the second coming all of Christ, all kinds of different core essential doctrines. And in that way, you're absolutely right, is as much as they'd like to say they're all inclusive and they're tolerant, as we all know, if viewers have watched Frank's live stream very much or listened to his podcast, tolerance, the modern version of tolerance, really just bottoms out in an absolutism that's very, very intolerant in its core nature.
And they will say that in order to love us, you must approve of what we do. But of course, love does not require approval. They couldn't love us because they don't approve of what we do.
Right.
So if you had to approve of everything somebody did to love them, you couldn't really love anybody, because you might disagree with people you probably disagree with everybody on something, right? And in order to love people, you have to stand in the way of any evil or hurtful thing that they want to do. And if you don't do that, then you're not loving. So in fact, I just did a presentation on this at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills, one of my favorite churches in America, just before the lockdown. And the title was, Does Love Require Approval? Folks can see it on our YouTube channel or Facebook page. And of course, the answer is no. Any parent knows that if you approve of everything your child wants to do, you're unloving. So, Alisa, have you had any kind of interaction? I know your new book, which I just can't wait for it to come out because it's so well done. It really is. You've done a wonderful job. And it's your first book. It's called Another Gospel. Maybe we can put it in the chat here in a little bit. It's coming out in October, but you sent me an advance copy to put an endorsement on it. And it's really a wonderful book. But is there any interaction you've had with people who would consider themselves progressive Christians? Have you had any sort of Facebook debates or people on your podcast to talk about these issues?
Yeah, I've had a couple of those. Of course, I have a lot of interaction in my personal life as I've watched a lot of my friends go down this path. But publicly, I've done a couple of sort of discussion type situations. In progressive Christianity, they're not going to really like the word debate, because at the bottom of it, there's sort of this underlying relativism anyway. So the whole idea of a debate wouldn't really make sense. But I have gone on a progressive Christian podcast to discuss some of these ideas with the progressive Christians that ran that podcast. I also had I thought it was a very interesting discussion with Lisa Gungor on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable podcast. And if anyone's not familiar, Lisa Gungor is one half of the very well-known Christian music group Gungor, who wrote songs that a lot of us sing in our churches, like Dry Bones and Beautiful Things. And they've written some amazing music. But over the past few years, their journey has gone from a more evangelical Christianity into a more progressive Christianity, into a bit of atheism for a little while, and back to a wider spirituality that includes even elements of Buddhism and Hinduism and mysticism and New Age. And sometimes I've heard them identify as Christian and other times not. But it was a very interesting conversation with Lisa, because we talked about some of these things, about what would be necessary to believe to be a Christian. And we talked about the resurrection, and it was just interesting kind of fleshing some of that out and seeing where the relativism that lies underneath this movement really leads to.
What are some of the core tenets then of the progressive Christian movement? What are their absolutes, as you would put it?
Yeah, well, that was a bit tough to define, because largely speaking, progressive Christians are not united around an official creed or an official statement of belief. In fact, their hallmark is that it's less important what you believe and it's more important what you do. So action is valued over belief. But if you read their materials, if you read their books, listen to their podcasts, some things emerge that are actually very concrete beliefs and what I would call core tenets. Of course, we talked about one of those, which would be the gay affirming pro-gay theology would be one of them. But when it comes to, say, things like the Bible and the cross and the gospel, some key elements that it would appear all progressive, at least leaders, are agreed on, is that there's a denial of original sin. They don't believe that we have a sin nature, that most of them wouldn't even believe that the Adam and Eve story is literal. So they don't believe in any kind of a fall that ushered sin into the world and that was passed down through them. And that, of course, leads into their view of the atonement. So, largely speaking, progressive Christian leaders do not affirm the blood atonement of Jesus. They don't believe that Jesus died to pay the price for our sins. In fact, in their view, if the Father required the blood sacrifice of his Son to reconcile him to humanity, that turns God into a cosmic child abuser. And so that phrase, cosmic child abuse or divine child abuse, is used quite often to describe the historic view of the atonement in the progressive movement. So for them, the cross becomes more of an example. Jesus showed us the way forward by submitting to our bloodlust and showing us a way to forgive. So we should follow his example in those things. Another kind of key tenet would be the view of the Bible. They assume a lot of secular and atheistic assumptions about the Bible. So many progressive leaders will outright admit that they use the lenses of historical criticism and liberation theology and feminist Bible interpretations to interpret their Bible. And so they desupernaturalize many of the miracles. That's why in the progressive movement, the resurrection, you might find progressive Christians who believe in the physical resurrection and others who don't, but they're perfectly fine to be in unity with each other because it's really just not about what you believe about it. And so it's more about the moral story or what we can learn from that story. And so then the view of the Bible is, rather than it being the authoritative and inspired view of God, of the Word of God, what they'll view the Bible as is more like an ancient spiritual travel journal. So we look at what our ancestors believed about God in the times and places that they lived. But when Moses, for example, when it says in Leviticus, "Thus saith the Lord," or "the Lord said to Moses," in the progressive view, that wasn't necessarily God actually speaking to and through Moses. That was just Moses's best attempt to understand God in his time and place and to say what he thought God would be speaking. And so that transfers all the way to the New Testament, which is why in progressive Christianity, it's not uncommon to hear a progressive Christian say, "Well, I disagree with Paul on this issue," or "I disagree with what Peter wrote in his letters." And so there's a very desupernaturalized view of the Bible and a very relativistic view of its authority. So the authority essentially is transferred from the text to your own thoughts and feelings and biases and opinions.
I'm reminded of something Augustine said, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, "If you don't believe the Gospels, you just believe yourself."
Yeah.
You're not getting revelation. You're just believing whatever you want to believe. So if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or that's not a key tenet, and the atonement isn't the center of Christianity, what, in their view, is the purpose of Jesus?
Right. And that's the key question, because if you take away the idea that we're sinners in need of salvation, if you take away the idea that God provided that salvation through the blood sacrifice of his Son, what are you left with? You have to have some sort of a cause that's going to unify you, that you're going to rally around. Well, remember earlier I mentioned that in this movement, works are really valued over belief. And so it becomes a very works-based gospel. And what I've noticed just in the last, maybe especially ramping up in the last year or two, is this acceptance of the cultural assumptions of critical theory, which is essentially functions like a worldview that sees the world as a struggle between oppressed group and their oppressors. Now, on first blush, a lot of Christians will say, well, as Christians, we want to do good works. We want to stand up for the oppressed. And yes, of course we do. But in progressive Christianity, these works, this type of new type of social justice becomes the gospel. This really becomes what unifies them is this activism to stand up to systems of power, to overthrow systems of power, to equalize the playing field. And so, which is why the LGBTQ issue is so important in the movement of progressive Christianity, because they're not just seeing homosexuality as a struggle or as a type of sin that someone would struggle with, just as we all have sins we struggle with, but they've actually accepted the cultural definition of that being an actual identity. So to stand against homosexual behavior in their mind is to actually stand against people that God created. And so there's a lot of secular cultural assumptions that have snuck their way in to the movement, which is really what makes it, not that theologically it's that different from what we might call liberal Christianity. Theology is virtually the same, but progressive Christianity is a very pointed movement that's seeking to change the evangelical church's mind on a lot of these issues. And that's what makes it so easily defined in our day and time as this movement of progressive Christianity.
Why do you think it is so attractive to people? Is it because of the cultural pressure of the sexual issues that people will go, well, look, I can have spirituality, I can have God, but I don't need to have these unpopular views about sexuality? Is that the real draw to it?
I think that's definitely one of them. So, in my experience and all of my research, I have not come across anyone who calls themselves a progressive Christian who is converted to progressive Christianity from a different worldview. So, I've never come across a Hindu who heard the social justice gospel of progressive Christianity and
Mm.
converted to that. I would say, until somebody proves me wrong, virtually 100% of progressive Christians are converted out of the evangelical church, and they're lifelong uh, members of the evangelical church. So these are people who have grown up in the evangelical church, they've grown up in Christian homes, and there was something about that they're walking away from. So it could be that they experienced some kind of spiritual abuse, and their concerns weren't considered or weren't cared for. So they go to the progressive church who's ready to welcome them with open arms. Or, like you said, they find the moral demands of historic Christianity to be just too much. And so
Mm.
they say, well, I don't want that, but I still want to kind of in some way hold on to Jesus. So here's a group of people that's going to let me do that. There are other
Mm.
issues. Maybe they grew up in a really legalistic background and they never
Mm.
were taught how to discern the essentials from the non-essential issues. And so it's all just this kind of mixed bag for them. And it's difficult for them to parse out the cardinal tenets of Christianity versus the things that we can agree to disagree on. And so I think there are a lot of elements. Trouble with the Bible is a big one. Rachel Held
Mhm.
Evans wrote about this in her book about the Bible. When she was a little girl, she would read it and it was magical to her. And then as she grew older, she began to realize that colorful picture of Noah's Ark that she colored in Sunday school is actually quite a horrific story of God's judgment on mankind. And so it caused her to question then the nature and character of God. So instead of just saying, okay, I don't believe Christianity is true, I think the Bible is false, there is some kind of a sociological need to hang on to what they believe Jesus is and who they think that he was. And so often I find that these views are very much informed by a subjective view of Jesus. The
Mm.
not biblically literate. Now, some of the leaders and the promoters of the movement are biblically literate, but a lot of on the lay level they're not. And so they assign the name Jesus to whatever they think is good or whatever they prefer, or the way they might do something then becomes the way Jesus would do something. So it becomes very subjective in its definitions.
You had, and by the way, before we go on here, I want to mention we've got a lot of people watching online right now, Alisa, and they're going to want to ask you some questions here in a few minutes. In about 10 minutes or so, we'll get to your questions. If you want to ask a question of Alisa on progressive liberal Christianity, type the word question in big block letters and make sure your question is succinct in complete English. And we'll try and get to it here in just a minute. You wrote a great article on the Gospel Coalition, which I follow quite a bit. If you guys don't have the Gospel Coalition app, you ought to get it. It's a pretty good place to get sort of Christian stories that are relevant. Anyway, couple of months ago, there was maybe it's longer than that now, 3 or 4 months ago, there was a couple of YouTubers, Rhett and Link, who I had never heard of until this happened. And they were YouTubers. They weren't really talking about Christianity, but they had a big following. And they came out and basically said that they're no longer Christians. Their faith has been deconstructed. You wrote a very nice response to them. What was the gist of what first of all, why did they say they left Christianity? And then what did you say in response?
Well, like you, I hadn't heard of them before I started getting texts from pastors, actually. The first I heard of it was a local pastor here texted me and said, "Have you watched this YouTube video of these guys deconstructing? It's
Hmm.
wrecking the faith of the kids in my youth group." And
Hmm.
I had never heard of them, but that was sort of the first inkling that something was going on. Then I started to see it pop up all over my news feed. And then I spent a whole day researching Rhett and Link. And so basically, they were incredibly popular YouTubers with millions of views. And I can't remember exactly how many followers, but very, very popular YouTubers, hilariously funny, very engaging. In fact, it was the most fun I've ever had researching anyone, is just watching some of their zany, silly stunts they do on Facebook. Well, I came to discover that they also had been lifelong Christians, grew up in the evangelical church. And what made their deconstruction, I think, more powerful maybe than some others is that they were actually on staff at Campus Crusade for Christ for a while. They were missionaries for a while. So these were guys that portrayed a very convincing story that they were real Christians. And then they each took I think it was about a couple hours each, walking all of their viewers through their deconstruction. So essentially they're saying, look, we were committed Christians. They spent a lot of time trying to convince us that they were. They set up all kinds of roadblocks. They mentioned all the apologetics books they'd read. They seem to be familiar with Ravi Zacharias's portrayal of the moral argument. They seem to be familiar with Tim Keller. I mean, the intellectual heavyweights that we would say, well, hey, if you're doubting your faith, read a Tim Keller book or read a Ravi
Hmm.
Zacharias book. But they apparently had already read all those books. And so it was, I think that's why it was so disturbing to a lot of people, and not just young people, but I actually had personally people who are in ministry even reach out to me and say, look, this rattled me. I know that this isn't right, but their stories actually rattled me. And so when I worked with Gospel Coalition to write this post, I wanted to really put my finger on why this is so compelling, because as I watched their stories, there really wasn't anything they were saying that was any different from any atheist you'd see on Twitter saying, well, I started to think evolution was true, so I thought Christianity was false. And, they started with a lot of the same places with young earth and old earth, and then moving to evolution and kind of slowly but surely moving their way out. The sexual issue had a part to play in there as well. There was some cultural assumptions about the oppression that the church has had toward women and people of the LGBT community, that played a role as well. But what stood out to me the most, I think, over the whole thing is just how compelling it was, because so many young people had spent every single day with these guys. And so I thought back to when I was a little girl. I was madly in love with Ricky Schroeder. I watched the show Silver Spoons every time it came on. And but back then, I didn't have any access to Ricky Schroeder. He wasn't on
Right.
Twitter tweeting about what he ate for lunch or this or that. So if I was lucky, I might get an autographed photo from his fan club. But really, there was no way to find out what was going on with his beliefs. And so we didn't connect. I don't think I connected with celebrities in the way that people do now. So now, fast forward all these years later, and not only do you have, like, back then it was one episode a week of an actor playing a character, but now we have daily, in many cases, episodes of not just actors playing a character, but people playing themselves with their own personalities. So you get to know them, you come to love them, you come to respect them. And I think that's why that particular deconstruction story had so much power. Because if you really look at it, if you really analyze it, especially Rhett, which is his was more of an intellectual sort of takedown in his mind of Christianity. But if you really, really watch it, he never actually interacts with the claims he brings up against Christianity. The playbook on his deconstruction was essentially, hey, I started to have these questions and I read this secular atheistic literature and I became became convinced that was true. And then I read a Ravi Zacharias book, but I wasn't convinced. And so then back to this stuff. And he
Yeah.
never, though, interacts with maybe the arguments that Ravi has brought against that secular claim that he became so convinced was true. But by saying, hey, I read that stuff, it's no good.
Hmm.
Now, all of the teens that follow him and that love him and think he's so funny, when they doubt their faith and a youth pastor says, well, hey, here's a Ravi Zacharias book, they're more likely now to say, oh, well, yeah, I know about that. That's not convincing, even though they probably haven't read it for themselves. And so I think there was a great rhetorical power in what Rhett and Link accomplished with their deconstruction stories.
What would you say would be the biggest argument they brought against Christianity? Do you recall? Was there one thing they said, oh, this makes Christianity false? Was there one thing?
I don't recall there being one just smoking gun issue. And that's what made it so confusing for me, because I kept watching. Like when he brought up young earth, I'm like, oh, he needs to know that there's an old earth view. And then he says, oh, but I know there's an old earth view. And so he kept kind of going along. And even when he became convinced evolution was true, he even said, I know there are Christians who think that evolution is true. So that shouldn't have been it. But then he goes on and on and on. And I think it might have had something to do with the resurrection, with becoming convinced that maybe the resurrection didn't really happen. And so on one hand, I appreciate the intellectual honesty of Rhett and Link to say, hey, I don't think Christianity is true, so I'm going to reject it and walk away, as opposed to what many progressive Christians do is come to virtually all the same conclusions he has, but say, but I'm still going to call myself a Christian. I'm still going to hold on to my idea of Jesus. I'm just going to redefine the whole thing. So in one way, I kind of respect that they did that they recognize that Christianity means something, that there's defining factors that have made Christianity unique in the world for our entire 2,000-year history. And they were honest enough to say, I don't believe it's true, so I'm walking away. But ultimately, he kind of got around to it at the end. I think the big one was, like you mentioned earlier in this show, is that the sexuality, the biblical sexuality. He sort of brushed over it, but he said that was kind of fermenting the whole time, what he perceived to be oppression toward women and toward his LGBTQ friends in the church.
Yeah, you've heard follow the money. I think in many cases today, you can follow the sex to see where somebody stands on a certain issue. And look, I'm not trying to judge the motives of these people. I mean, to a certain extent, I think that if they're trying to affirm the LGBT community, there's some nobility in that, in the sense they want people to be happy. They want people to be able to express themselves. There is some nobility in the idea that how can we help these people? I just think they're going about it the wrong way. If you want to help somebody, you got to tell them the truth, not just affirm everything they want to do. Right. But look, before we get to questions from the audience, I got to ask you this question, Alisa. There's people watching right now. We've got quite a following watching right now. And I'm thinking of a parent who might have a daughter or a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law who is now fallen into progressive Christianity. What kind of advice would you give that person?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because I do get that question a lot through my website and on social media. And all I can say is that when I was going through my dark time of doubt, and what I really believe was a deconstruction, I deconstructed my beliefs down to the very base beliefs, even asking the question, does God even exist? And then God, in his outrageous faithfulness and grace to me, helped rebuild my faith using apologetics and good intellectual reasoning. But when I was in that really dark, confused place, there were a couple people in my life that responded quite differently, and the fruit of their responses were very evident in my life. And so I'll just give you those examples. The first person reacted with a lot of fear. Every time I would mention anything I was doubting or a question that I had, this person would sort of seize up in fear and say, you shouldn't believe that. That's wrong. You know the truth. Just believe. Just the Bible says so, and things like that, which caused me to want to retreat from that person and not tell them what was going on in my life. And so the second person that I think responded really well to me was a person who every time that I'm so sorry. Every time that I had a question or a doubt, this person would respond really with this openness, and there was no fear. So this person would say, well, they'd ask me questions. Why does that rattle you? What is it about that that causes you to doubt? And then, hey, let's look at some answers together. And so I think for Christian parents who have a kid going through this, my first response would be fear. I know that. I would just be like, why is my kid going through this? And why don't they just grasp the truth? But I think being patient and asking a lot of questions rather than making dogmatic truth claims is really the way to go. With somebody going through this type of doubt, this type of deconstruction, they need to feel safe with you. They need to feel like you're not going to just become a fearful person when they express their doubts. Be an open and a warm place for them to come with their doubts and then walk through it together. You don't have to know all the answers. Just offer to research it with them. Offer to read the Rabbi Zacharias book together or the Frank Turek book. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist was a huge resource that contributed to my reconstruction. I mean, it just basically walked me through a reconstruction. So if you feel like you can just calm yourself down and have openness so that there's an inviting situation for your kid to come back with more, I think that's probably the best way to go about it.
And there's a couple of questions you can ask them. One is, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Evangelical Christianity, if that were true, would you become a Christian? The second question I think you can ask them is, particularly if you know that sex is a motivator here, is that if God really existed and really wanted you to behave in a certain way sexually, he wanted you to refrain from certain sexual behaviors, would you obey him? And then just be quiet and see what the person says. Because if the answer is no, there's nothing else you can do.
Right.
It's not a matter of the head, it's a matter of the heart, and they don't want to have their mind changed.
Right.
We've got so many questions here from our viewers right now. Let's bring the great Jorge Gill on, and he's going to give us some great questions for Alisa Childers. What do you got today, Jorge?
Well, howdy, both of you. Doing great. Happy to be here. Let me turn my volume down. I sound like, a super echo in my head, but we're here. Alisa, good to see you. Miss Winnie says, I feel like I need a degree in apologetics. How does the lay person learn to defend our faith against these heresies?
Well, that's a great question. And I had to kind of figure that out for myself as well, because I also don't have a degree in apologetics. I don't have a degree in anything. I just studied on my own. And sort of like I mentioned before, start with Frank's book. Start with I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, because that will walk you through the case for the existence of truth and to the existence of God, the resurrection, the truth of Christianity, the Bible. It'll walk you through all of those things. And then if you find yourself interested in one of those topics more than another, like I found myself more interested in the arguments surrounding biblical reliability than anything else, because that was what was most under attack in the class that I was in. And so from Frank's book, I started to get other books on biblical reliability and really focus in on that. I even took some online courses on textual criticism and things like that. So you can do all kinds of stuff like that, but you don't have to have a degree in apologetics to be able to spot heresy. What you really need to do is know the real thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you are studying your Bible, if you're reading God's word and you're hiding that in your heart and you're getting it in to your soul, you will be able to spot any heresy when it comes across your news feed, because you know the real thing so well. And there's the famous anecdote, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but there's this famous anecdote that FBI agents are trained to spot counterfeit money by studying the real thing. And I think there's a real truth at the core of that, because if that's what they're doing, then any counterfeit that comes across their desk, they're going to spot immediately. They don't have to study the counterfeit. They just have to study the real thing.
It's good stuff. I got another one. Joey O'Brien says, hey, Alisa, as you said, progressive Christians are moving away from the core biblical doctrines. Are many United Methodists progressive Christian denominations?
I'm not an expert on the United Methodist denomination, but from what I've observed, and Frank may know more about this than I do, it seems like there's a bit of a split. And what it appears to be is that in foreign countries and other places, they tend to be a little more conservative and historic, but here in the States, they tend to slide a little more to the liberal side. So I think we've seen a lot of the battle over that going on in the United Methodist denomination, as we've seen happen in all the other major denominations. We saw this happen in the Presbyterian Church with that split, and Episcopalian Church. So I think that's kind of what we're observing in our time with the United Methodists.
Yeah. Kayla Sanders. And by the way, I want to let everybody know we are not only on the Facebook pages for Cross Examine and Frank Turek, but we're also in Alisa Childers' Facebook page. So we want to say hey to everybody. We're watching from Alisa's page, YouTube, and our app, and also our website. So hey to everybody. Kayla says, what is the significance of the progressive belief in a spiritual and not a physical resurrection of Christ? How can I explain to someone who believes in a spiritual resurrection why this physical resurrection is important?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, I think this can be answered by thinking back to a blog post that was written a few years ago by a progressive Christian pastor about how to talk to your kids about Easter. This is a very popular progressive Christian blog that this was published on. And essentially, this progressive Christian pastor was saying, you should teach your kids that something doesn't have to be a historical fact to have meaning, to have a way to apply to our lives. And so how she applied that to the kids' lives was to teach them to follow Jesus as an example, that, you know, even though people wanted to kill him, he was loving to them. And then when his disciples, whether they really saw him after he was dead or not, they felt comforted and they felt loved. And so from her perspective, the idea that no matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, we should feel comforted and loved. And I think that that's essentially the meaning that a lot of them get out. Now, some people will flesh it out even more and say that the resurrection shows us, you know, as an example of the seasons, things die and things come back to life. And we see that happen in all of our lives. So there's sort of this metaphorical application that happens when it comes to the resurrection. But to answer the second part of the question, the reason that it matters that Jesus' resurrection was physical is because Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain and you're still in your sins. And so, according to Paul, if the resurrection of Jesus wasn't a literal historical fact, then Christianity as an entire belief system is false. I mean, it's what Christianity essentially is based on, is the resurrection of Jesus. So if I became convinced that the resurrection of Jesus did not happen in real time in history, then I would not be a Christian. I would have no reason to say, hey, Christianity is true. Because essentially the resurrection is how Jesus proved true all the things he said about who he was, about why he came. And so if that didn't happen, then he didn't prove those things true and he was just some guy. And so it's actually a matter of life and death whether or not the resurrection of Jesus actually happened. And I recommend just going to Paul for that. I mean, Paul said you can prove the whole thing wrong if you can prove the resurrection wrong.
By the way, those of you who are asking questions about apologetics, how do I be a better apologist and all this? Well, Alisa just came to CIA, the Cross-Examine Instructor Academy, a few years back and did so well. We put her on the teaching team. So you don't have to have a degree to do this necessarily. She's self-taught and she's read a lot, and she's now helping myself and Jay Warner Wallace and Greg Kokel and Sean McDowell and others actually teach this to people. And this year it's going to be in Dallas in August. And don't worry about the virus. Viruses can't live in Dallas in August. Very few people can. So that's where we're going to be. And Alisa will be with us August 6th to 8th. But you got to apply. And we don't take very many people. So check that out on the website. Let's go to more questions.
Elijah asks, progressive Christianity is beginning to creep into my church youth group. I love these people and I'm worried about them. How do I address this issue in a Christian way?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? I think one of the most common comments I receive through my website is that very thing. I'm seeing this in my church, and my pastor quoted a progressive leader, and what do I do? And I think that the best way to go about it is to talk to your leadership about it, to just sit down in a non-threatening way, ask some questions. Maybe, you know, I don't know what the specific issue is that you're seeing creep in, but just ask about it. Say, you know, I noticed you said this.
Oops. We lost Alisa. We'll get her back in. Frank, we can do.
Yeah, well, let me just.
Oh, there she is.
There she is. She's
Hold
back
on,
already.
let me bring it back in. There you go. That was quick.
A big question mark on my face. Where'd she go? We don't know. So I don't know how much of that you heard, but
well, that was appropriate. You said ask questions, and the big question.
Ask questions in it. I thought it was an effect you was added into it.
Yes. Yeah, that worked out nicely. But yeah, ask questions, talk to your leadership about it. Depending on, I think all of this also depends on the person's actual maturity level themselves. Like if you're a mature Christian and you feel led to stay in a church for a little while and try to fight some of those battles, I know people who are doing that in their churches. But I also think that if you're a newer Christian who is a little confused by some of these ideas, if you see progressive Christian ideas coming into your church, if those things are being taught from the pulpit, I think it's perfectly acceptable to find another church, to find a place that's going to be faithful to biblical teaching. And I think each of those battles, depending on your maturity level and your calling, might be different, but definitely start with a conversation with your leadership. I've seen some of those be fruitful and some of them not. And that's when you'll have to make your decision. But
that's very good.
Keep it to yourself, get it in the open and have some discussions.
Yeah, we are all tempted to make God in our own image. And that's what progressive Christianity is all about. Yeah. We have to guard that in ourselves, not just other people. We want God to be like us when in fact we should try and be like God. So we have to be very careful when people are saying, in fact, that was the first lie, wasn't it? Did God really say? Did he really say that? You don't want to believe that, do you? Did he really say that's basically progressive Christianity? It's saying, did God really say this? Or did God really do this? Oh, no, you can believe your own thing. Well, that's not Christianity. Stop calling yourself a Christian if you're going to disagree with Jesus. Stop, that's right. Okay? Just call yourself something else.
Yeah, we're little idol factories. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We're going to show some love to Alisa's Facebook page. We got a question from them. We got my guys screening those questions too. Is there a difference between apostasy and deconstruction, Alisa?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So apostasy, as far as I understand it, is when someone was a Christian and rejects that and walks away from it. Now, I think, unless my definitions are off, the difference between that and deconstruction is that deconstruction is a process in which you are picking apart what you believe, and that can land people in different places. So some people deconstruct all the way into apostasy. Some people deconstruct maybe to flirting with atheism, but then reconstruct back to an Orthodox historic faith. Others will deconstruct into more of a progressive type Christianity, which I believe is apostasy. So I think that can be the end result of deconstruction. But I think that if Christianity is true, if the nature of truth is what we think it is, then you can deconstruct and reconstruct as many times as you want. And you're going to always land on Christianity being true because it is true. And so I don't think deconstruction in and of itself is necessarily going to lead someone to apostasy. But we should all be examining our beliefs and testing those beliefs. The Bible even tells us to test our beliefs. But often deconstruction can end in apostasy.
Wow. We got Tracy Lynn, where this is from Frank's Facebook page. It says, how do you talk to a progressive Christian to help them see the error in their ways? I have a pastor, a friend who has become very liberal after his divorce.
Yeah, and that's something I would love a sociologist to do the work on this, of the connection between progressive Christianity and divorce, because so often when someone goes into the progressive movement, there's there's always a divorce, either after or before. It just seems to be that way, but I don't see any data on it, but I'd love somebody to do that study. But essentially, how do you talk to your pastor? I would say, number one, and I think Frank would agree with this, I think Jorge would agree with this, get Greg Koukল's book, Tactics. The same tactics that you're going to use to talk to unbelieving friends and friends of other faith are the exact same tactics you're going to use. I know
I even have it in Spanish, so I one up both for you. I got it in Spanish. Sí, señor.
Nice, tácticas. get that book because it's the exact same tactics. In fact, I'm in the middle of interviewing Greg on a 2-part series for my podcast on how to talk to your progressive Christian friends using tactics. And so we're applying that directly to progressive Christianity, but it's the same thing. Ask questions. Don't put yourself in the position of making all the truth claims that you have to defend. Keep the burden of proof on the other person. So asking questions is the best way to do that. And as Greg says, the goal is to just put a little pebble in their shoe. You know, we've all experienced that where we walk around, there's got a rock in your shoe, and like you kind of try to keep walking, but then eventually you have to stop and get that rock out because it's irritating you. And so Greg says, you know, I'm not trying to convert you. I just want to irritate you a little bit. And I think that sort of should be the goal, is to ask those types of questions to keep yourself from having to make truth claims and then the burden of proof being on you, but keep the burden of proof on the other person. Make them defend why they're believing all of these new doctrines and concepts, and why they're assuming these cultural assumptions, and just getting that book Tactics is going to be a great little crash course on how to do that.
Now, all of that, of course, assumes that the person is interested in reason and facts, and quite frequently they're not.
Right.
They're just interested in their own feelings and validating what happened to them. In fact, when we were down in Dallas a few years ago, myself, Jay Warner Wallace, and Mike Adams, and we were doing a Fearless Faith program, young lady came up to the book table and said, "You got a book on Buddhism?" And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, I have a friend who was a Christian, but now she's a Buddhist." I said, "Look, I don't know your friend at all, but can I just ask you a question? Has your friend started doing something that Jesus wouldn't want her to do?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "You don't need a book on Buddhism. It's not like she suddenly did research and said, you know what, Buddhism's true. What happened was she wanted to maintain spirituality without having moral accountability."
That's right.
Yeah.
And now Frank is gone, so it's me and you, Alisa.
Right, Jorge.
So yeah, now me and you taking over. There he's back. Hold on. See, you didn't last long enough. Me and Alisa were gonna take over. She was doing the hand thing and everything. She was like, "Man, we're gonna take over cross-examine now."
Someone didn't like that. There was Satan saying, "No, that's the key right there."
Yeah. Don't let him know. Yeah. Now I gotta ask this question. Because it's Robbie Hall. He is one of our CIA grads. Make sure you go to crossexamine.org, click on the events tab, click on CIA, what is CIA, and go ahead and apply, because we are going to be running out of space soon. But this is a great question. Looking back, do you find that CCM artists are solid in their theological beliefs, or do they tend to follow along with progressive theology? And I think this is very important because so many people are influenced through the arts.
Okay, so that is a very broad question. And of course, you know, that's going to depend on the artist. I know several CCM artists who are totally solid in their theology, and that love Jesus, are sold out for Jesus, and they're doing great. And then there are some who are not. I think that the whole sort of CCM world makes you vulnerable for bad theology, because you know, there's something about music that just glorifies the person. So I know as an artist I had to fight against that. I know my artist friends have had to fight against that. You're on the stage with lights, and everybody's attention is on you, and you're singing. You know that, you know, music moves people emotionally. So there's this sort of thing you have to struggle against. If you're trying to follow Jesus and you're trying to glorify him, that's probably always going to be a struggle. And I think just like any sort of venue that's vulnerable for progressive Christianity, the music world is vulnerable, because musicians are often on tour. It's very difficult to stay plugged into a local church and stay accountable in that way. So there's a kind of a lowered accountability often. So that can happen. Also, we're seeing a lot of music come out of churches that lean more into like what Costi Hinn might refer to as the mystical miracle movement. So there's a little bit of prosperity theology underneath it. So we have to be very discerning with the music that we listen to. In fact, I tell my kids this all the time. You have to filter everything through biblical truth, especially if it's labeled as Christian. And so often something that's labeled as Christian has very secular theology in the lyrics. But I think that's just sort of a case-by-case basis that we have to evaluate, because I do know some artists that are just just wonderful, solid Christians.
Yeah. Well, before we turn it over to you, Frank, I want to thank everybody who submitted questions. You guys already know we cannot go through all of them. There's so many great questions that I think we should invite Alisa back very soon and then continue to answer our audience's questions. But right now, Frank, is all yours.
Well, Lisa, I wanted to ask you about hope, because that's what this show is about. We're trying to give people hope through the lockdown. And people are being pulled away from the true hope by going with progressive Christianity. So where do we really find our true hope? And what would you recommend people do in order to really know that hope?
Yeah. Well, can I go deep for a second? I know we just have
Go.
minutes,
Yeah.
but all of us have been through difficult times in our lives. I know that you have, I have, everybody watching has, everybody suffers, everybody goes through hard times. Of course, those levels of suffering are going to vary. But the most difficult thing I have ever been through happened just this past November, when my 21-year-old nephew overdosed and died from drugs. And it's the hardest, hands down, hardest thing my family's ever been through. I walked with my sister very closely through the whole thing, still walking through it. Just absolutely devastating to our family. And through that situation, I can't explain this, but God's goodness, his faithfulness, his sovereignty were never on brighter display than they were in the throes of walking through that utter shock and horror of what happened with my nephew. Now, I thought about this as someone who's talking about progressive Christianity a lot. It actually made me more just passionate about talking about it, because as I walked through that horrific experience, I acknowledged that there is nothing that progressive Christianity has to offer me that would give me any hope in that situation, any hope in what the world is walking through right now, any hope with whatever people are going through who are watching this. If I didn't have the hope that God is sovereign, that he's in control, that my nephew, who had dedicated his life to God a year before he died, if I didn't have the hope that I would see him again, or that his life is in God's hands, I would have no hope at all. And the progressive Christian gospel doesn't give me any of that hope. If there's no reality of sin, if there's no reality of the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, if there's no reality of his resurrection that my nephew will take part in, as we all will one day, then I have no hope but to just hang my head and say, well, Jesus is here, I guess. And so that's where I think that historic Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, has not just truth to give us, not just the truth about reality that we need to submit our lives to Jesus' lordship, but it actually gives us great comfort in times of despair, in times where we're walking through difficult things. And I think that's ultimately the choice we all have. We can take just the heaping piles of all of our disappointment and our trouble and our hardship, and we can pile that in God's lap and say, I don't know the answer, but you do, and I trust you. Or we can shake our fist at him and declare him to not exist or to be morally repugnant. We all have that choice. But I just can tell you from just this experience I had this past year that taking all of those burdens and putting them in Jesus' lap is the only thing that will offer true and lasting hope.
Thanks for sharing that, Alisa, because that's so real. And I know that some people out there watching have experienced this kind of loss before. Can you just share in a couple of minutes what you really sensed? Because in terms of comfort, because some people who are watching have never had somebody really close to them die. How did the Holy Spirit become real to you through that whole ordeal?
Well, it's almost hard to articulate, because I had experiences of the Holy Spirit growing up where I'd feel all those feelings, but through apologetics and studying and going through this time of doubt, I learned to not go by what I feel, but to go by what I know is true. And when I became convinced intellectually that Christianity is true, that the resurrection happened in history, that everything that Jesus said about who he was is true. He is who he said he was. There was a moment when we first found out about my nephew and I was at the hospital, and it felt like utter darkness. I can't describe it except to say it just felt like all hope was sucked out of the universe. I couldn't believe it was happening. And in that moment, I made a decision. I said, I can go by what I feel right now, or I can go by what I know. And I got in my car and I started crying out to Jesus. And I just said, Jesus, Jesus. And it felt like I was shouting into a void. But I'm telling you, over the course of the next 24 hours, 48 hours, and the next days and weeks, the presence of God was so near to my family. And even just watching my whole family come together, glorify God, watching my sister say, do not be surprised by the fiery trial that's come upon you. She's quoting these verses, having buried her only son. And that was a testimony to me that was so powerful. But it was just beautiful how the Holy Spirit worked the apologetics together with the experiences of the presence of God in such a beautiful way for my whole family.
You blessed a lot of people today, Alisa. Thank you so much. And we're going to have you back on. Progressive Christianity is much more seductive than atheism or Islam or any other worldview. But there's no hope in it, as you put it. And there is hope in the truth. There is hope in Orthodox historic Christianity. And that's where we want everyone here to put our hope. Just so you know, tomorrow, you've probably heard people say there's no evidence for the Exodus from Egypt. There's actually evidence from Egypt for the Exodus. And Stephen Meyer and archaeologist Titus Kennedy will join us tomorrow for that. And then the great Max McLean, who's played C.S. Lewis so many times, will be our guest. And he's going to act out some of C.S. Lewis for us here on the Hope One live stream. So we'll see you here tomorrow for the Exodus and tomorrow and Friday for C.S. Lewis. And thank you, Alisa Childers. Go to her website, alisachilders.com, to follow Alisa, and you'll see her at CIA if you come to CIA this summer in August.
That's right. Thanks everybody for watching. Alisa, thank you once again. And tomorrow we'll be here at 11:30, Lord willing, to do the Hope One show.